The story of Andrei Chikatilo begins in Soviet Ukraine, in a small village named Yabloknoy, in 1936. Born into brutal poverty during Stalin's reign, Chikatilo's early life was defined by starvation, political repression, and violence. His family lived in a one-room hut. His father was drafted into World War II and captured by the Germans, later labeled a traitor by Soviet authorities. Andrei was bullied, weak, and bedwetting well into adolescence, doctors have said. But it wasn't until December 1978, at age 42, that Chikatilo's sadism transformed into murder. The victim was 9-year-old Lena Zakatnova, lured into an abandoned house in the town of Shakhty under the pretense of helping her find chewing gum. Chikatilo stabbed her repeatedly in a frenzied attack. He mutilated her body and threw it into a nearby river. This murder marked the beginning of a 12-year killing spree that would leave at least 52 confirmed victims. At the time, the Soviet Union's law enforcement system was plagued with bureaucracy and denial. The idea of a serial killer was considered a Western phenomenon, not something that could exist in a communist society. This attitude allowed Chikatilo to kill with virtual impunity in the early years. Lena's murder led to the wrongful arrest and execution of a man named Alexander Kravchenko, who had a prior conviction for sexual assault. Despite weak evidence, pressure to close the case led to a coerced confession. Kravchenko was executed in 1983. Meanwhile, Chikatilo was emboldened. He had gotten away with murder, and the state had killed an innocent man in his place. Over the next 2 years, Chikatilo kept a low profile, focusing on his job as a supply clerk. But the urges remained. By 1981, he resumed killing with renewed brutality. He developed a pattern, targeting young runaways, children, and women in isolated train stations and wooded areas. Most were lured with promises of food, shelter, or money. Many were stabbed dozens of times, sexually abused, or left dismembered. Chikatilo's crime spanned multiple Soviet republics including Rostov, Moscow, Uzbekistan, and Ukraine. This made it difficult for law enforcement to link the murders. He was a beast who traveled unnoticed by train, blending into crowds, vanishing as quickly as he appeared. By the end of 1983, 8 victims were dead, each case eerily similar, yet the KGB and militia refused to admit the killings were connected. In their denial, they gave Chikatilo a deadly head start. By 1984, Andrei Chikatilo had claimed at least 15 lives across the Soviet Union. But the problem was within Soviet society. The idea of a serial killer, especially one sexually motivated, was an ideological impossibility. The state maintained that such crimes were the result of capitalist depravity. This dangerous denial enabled Chikatilo to continue killing unchecked, as each murder was treated as an isolated incident or blamed on vagrants, mentally ill individuals, or hooligans. Many of Chikatilo's victims were among the most vulnerable. He preyed on the runaways, homeless children, and lonely women standing alone at train stations. He simply offered food, shelter, and cigarettes to trap his victims. Once isolated in his ideal location, the attacks began viciously and were reported to be ritualistic. Stabbings and slashings were often accompanied by grotesque mutilations. Reports of eyes being gouged out, nipples bitten off, and genitals mutilated. Yet no clear sexual violation was ever confirmed, suggesting psychological rather than physical gratification. Autopsies revealed that most of the victims were stabbed between 30 and 50 times. In a disturbingly close encounter with the law, Chikatilo was arrested briefly in 1984, after being seen near the scene of a crime with suspicious blood on his clothing. He was taken in for questioning and even included in a lineup viewed by the mother of one victim. But the witness hesitated, and Chikatilo managed to evade further scrutiny. DNA testing wasn't yet available, and the semen samples collected from several victims did not match his blood type. He had a rare medical condition where his semen type did not match his blood. This mismatch effectively cleared him in the eyes of investigators. Desperate to show progress, Soviet police arrested and convicted several other suspects. Some were mentally ill or forced into false confessions. In one tragic case, 18-year-old Alexander Spivak, who had intellectual disabilities, was convicted of a murder Chikatilo had committed and later died in custody. The real killer, meanwhile, remained at large and emboldened. Between 1984 and 1985, the body count surged. 11 more victims were discovered in the Rostov region alone. Forensic specialists noticed consistent patterns. There were knife wounds focused on the torso and face, post-mortem mutilation, and an absence of valuables or signs of robbery. Despite mounting similarities, the Ministry of Internal Affairs refused to acknowledge the existence of a serial killer. In 1985, a secret task force led by Moscow investigator Mikhail Fetisov and forensic psychiatrist Dr. Alexander Bukhanovsky was created to analyze the killer's psychology. Bukhanovsky's profile predicted a middle-aged reclusive man with a strong educational background and social awkwardness. But even with the profile in hand, the trail went cold. Chikatilo stopped killing for nearly a year, possibly due to increased police patrols and fear of arrest. He shifted focus to his family life and changed jobs frequently, moving from school work to traveling sales. Despite his horrific acts, he managed to maintain a strange facade of normalcy, attending school events for his children and even joining Communist Party activities. By 1989, the toll had quietly reached over 30 confirmed murders, yet Andrei Chikatilo somehow remained a free man slipping under the radar. But by now his patterns began to emerge for those paying attention. The murders shared forensic details. All of the stab wounds were created by the same size knife, also the same amount of care had been taken to clean parts of the crime scene. Behavioral evidence also surfaced. The killer was careful, organized, and likely educated. Victim profiles were similar, primarily female adolescents and young boys between ages 8 to 17, all vulnerable and often reported missing after visiting a railway hub. Chikatilo's profession gave him freedom. After losing his teaching job for inappropriate behavior, he worked as a traveling supply clerk. This provided cover and transit access to stations across multiple Soviet republics. He kept to himself, filed his paperwork, and left no major red flags. Families of victims, if they were lucky enough to get answers, were told little. Media coverage was non-existent. State censorship still controlled crime news, and publicly acknowledging a serial killer would be considered a national embarrassment. That silence served Chikatilo perfectly. He was becoming bolder, killing more frequently and with greater violence. In 1988 alone, he killed at least 7 confirmed victims across 3 regions. Authorities still didn't know his name, but their list of dead was growing. One detective, Viktor Burakov, who had worked hundreds of homicide cases in the Rostov area, began keeping his own personal records, mapping the murders and noting the patterns. He didn't have permission to openly declare a serial killer was operating, but he was quietly assembling a psychological and geographic profile. They didn't know it yet, but they were closing in on Chikatilo. He had started to sense the pressure. From 1989 to 1990, he altered his methods slightly, changing cities, shortening victim interactions, and disposing of bodies in even more remote areas. But it wasn't enough. The trail of blood he left behind had become impossible to hide. In September 1984, Chikatilo was arrested near a Rostov train station after acting suspiciously. Police found him loitering near a bus depot, his clothes muddy and his bag holding rope, a knife, and a jar of petroleum jelly, an odd assortment to say the least. He was also seen speaking to young boys before his arrest. Officers knew a murder had recently occurred in the area, and Chikatilo fit a general description from witnesses. But when they checked his name against the database, nothing raised alarms. He had no prior criminal record, despite losing his teaching job years earlier over molestation allegations, and he worked for a state-sanctioned company. The knife was ruled insufficiently linked to the current murder, and he was let go. The system had no centralized tracking of murders, and no official acknowledgement of a serial killer. He simply walked free. By 1985, after nearly 20 murders, Chikatilo's profile had been narrowed by psychiatrist Dr. Bukhanovsky. The profile was astonishingly accurate: a middle-aged, educated man, previously institutionalized or accused of deviant sexual behavior, familiar with rail networks, and driven by sexual compulsion rooted in childhood trauma. Yet even with this, there was no suspect database to cross-check employment history or former sexual misconduct. The tools simply didn't exist, or weren't permitted to be used at scale. Chikatilo continued to kill, adapting his methods and locations as soon as he suspected anyone was onto him. He avoided his earlier hunting grounds, moved across Soviet republics, and altered his victim profile to include more adult women and fewer children. His murders stretched into Ukraine and Uzbekistan, but his methods remained disturbingly similar: stabbing, biting, and post-mortem mutilation. He wore gloves, cleaned evidence, and often dumped bodies in secluded forests near rail yards. In 1987, he was again detained after attempting to speak to children at a Rostov station. Again, he was released. Meanwhile, the public remained unaware of any pattern. The Soviet press reported none of the murders. Families were often left in the dark, told only that their loved ones had died under unclear circumstances. No warnings were issued. There were no community alerts. The secrecy gave Chikatilo cover and freedom. It wasn't until 1989, when a series of bodies were found within a few kilometers of each other near Shakhty and Novocherkassk, that the Soviet authorities were forced to admit what Burakov and his team already knew: this was one man. And he was still killing. Even so, it took another year for the surveillance operation that would finally bring Chikatilo down to begin. By then, dozens more victims had died. In the timeline of Soviet justice, 1984 could have been the end of Chikatilo's killing spree. Instead, it marked the midpoint of the bloodshed. Because of arrogance, incompetence, and denial. By 1990, the body count had surged past 50. Panic was quietly spreading through investigative circles, even if the Soviet public remained largely unaware. Andrei Chikatilo had killed across multiple regions, adapting his method, evading detection, and exploiting a system paralyzed by secrecy. But the walls were finally closing in. After nearly a decade of failed leads, the KGB and the Ministry of Internal Affairs authorized an unprecedented surveillance campaign. It would be the largest criminal manhunt in Soviet history, involving over 300 investigators across multiple regions. With murders now regularly occurring near rail stations, detectives deployed plainclothes officers to monitor heavily trafficked transit hubs. A pattern began to emerge. Chikatilo's movements were linked to the Soviet rail network. He often traveled by night, selected isolated stations, and approached vulnerable individuals. Once, he was seen attempting to lure a young boy into the woods at Leskor station in Rostov. The boy resisted and ran off. The man vanished. Investigators cross-referenced railway workers, engineers, and traveling salesmen who matched the FBI-style profile developed by forensic psychiatrist Dr. Alexander Bukhanovsky. On November 6, 1990, Chikatilo struck again, murdering a 22-year-old woman named Sveta Korostik in a wooded area near a train station in Novocherkassk. It would be his last killing. What Chikatilo didn't know was that he had been spotted by a young police officer, assigned to stake out the area. The officer noted his odd behavior, wandering without purpose, wearing mismatched clothing, eyes darting toward children and lone women. He was approached and questioned. His answers were vague. He gave his name, Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo, and claimed to be on a business trip. No arrest was made, but his name was flagged. 2 days later, when Korostik's mutilated body was found not far from where Chikatilo had been seen, the lead was taken seriously. Authorities reviewed his record and noted a 1984 arrest, along with the odd items found in his bag. Investigators dug deeper and found he'd once been fired from a teaching job after accusations of molesting students. The coincidences were too strong to ignore. On November 20, 1990, Chikatilo was placed under round-the-clock surveillance. He was trailed discreetly through Rostov-on-Don. Officers observed him approaching women and children in public places, sometimes initiating small talk, other times lurking near public restrooms or bus stops. He seemed to be hunting. 3 days later, investigators saw him shoplifting in a local store. It was minor, but it gave them legal grounds for an arrest. They took him in. At the time of arrest, Chikatilo was 54 years old. He looked unremarkable, balding, grey, wearing drab Soviet clothing. Nothing about him screamed serial killer. But when questioned, his detached demeanor turned into evasion, denial, and visible agitation. The first few days of interrogation yielded little. Chikatilo denied everything. But detectives weren't bluffing. They had DNA links from several crime scenes, fibers, and survivor testimonies. Still, there was no confession. Enter Dr. Buchanovsky. The psychiatrist who had built the killer's profile was now called in to conduct a psychological evaluation. In a legendary session, Buchanovsky spent over an hour calmly speaking to Chikatilo. He tapped into Chikatilo's fractured mind and broken childhood. Then, Chikatilo broke. He confessed in a trance-like monologue to 34 murders, later revising it to 56. He described each one in haunting detail. Where he met the victim, how he lured them, how they fought, and how he stabbed, bit, or mutilated them. He recalled dates, clothing, and exact train stations. His memory was photographic, his remorse was non-existent. Investigators were horrified. The methodical nature of the killings, the coldness, the utter lack of empathy, it painted a portrait of evil far beyond anything the Soviet Union had publicly acknowledged. More shockingly, he took police to the body sites, places where remains had never been recovered. In multiple cases, he accurately described hidden graves, victims' names, and the precise time and location of their deaths. By the end of the interrogations, the number of confirmed victims reached at least 52. The Soviet Union had just uncovered its worst serial killer. But the horror wasn't over yet. The next battle would take place in court. The Soviet Union had arrested a monster. But what do you do when a man calmly confesses to murdering 52 people and seems to feel nothing? Andrei Chikatilo's 1990 arrest sent shockwaves through both the justice system and a public still unaware of the full scale of his crimes. Soviet media, once tightly controlled, began to cautiously release details of the investigation. But nothing could prepare the country for the spectacle of the trial to come. In April 1992, after more than a year of psychiatric evaluation and legal wrangling, Chikatilo was declared mentally fit to stand trial. His defense argued that his psychosis, rooted in early trauma and neurological dysfunction, should exempt him from criminal responsibility. But state psychiatrists disagreed. They described him as suffering from severe personality disorders, including schizoid and sadistic tendencies, but fully aware of his actions. The trial was held in Rostov-on-Don, the same region where many of the murders occurred. But this was no ordinary courtroom. It had to be specially modified, with iron bars surrounding the defendant's dock because of how intensely the public wanted retribution. Andrei Chikatilo, the man once mistaken for a frail school teacher, now stood caged in a steel cell during the entire trial. But as the charges were read aloud, 53 counts of murder, the courtroom sat frozen. His behavior was disturbing. During proceedings, Chikatilo often shouted, rambled incoherently, stripped naked, or turned to the crowd and screamed obscenities. At times, he banged his head against the bars. Other times, he stared at the victims' families with a chilling calm. But his confessions left no doubt. Investigators had recorded detailed sketches, crime scene walkthroughs, and chilling interviews where Chikatilo outlined his methods with surgical precision. He admitted to luring children with candy or stories, waiting at train stations, choosing his victims at random. He recalled how he often failed sexually with women, but found release through violence. Most of the killings involved stabbing, biting, and eye mutilation, a symbolic gesture that he believed prevented victims from seeing him in the afterlife. One victim's relative screamed in court, "May you rot like my daughter did." Another fainted as Chikatilo described what he had done to her child. Several families had waited years for closure, and now they were hearing every gruesome detail. Testimony after testimony painted a picture of systemic failure. Soviet police had arrested at least 9 innocent men during the years of the killings, some of whom confessed under pressure. One man was even executed for a Chikatilo murder he didn't commit. That revelation stunned the courtroom. The cost of bureaucratic denial was not just more victims, but state-sanctioned injustice. The prosecution presented over 200 volumes of evidence, forensic matches, confessions, witness statements, and Chikatilo's own handwritten maps and notes. His signature style, multiple stab wounds, sexual mutilation, and post-mortem abuse, was consistent across decades of killings. The defense, meanwhile, clung to the insanity plea, arguing that no sane man could perform such acts. But the court ruled that Chikatilo planned his crimes, selected vulnerable targets, covered his tracks, and fled when approached, signs of intent and self-preservation. On October 15, 1992, Judge Leonid Akubjanov found Chikatilo guilty on 52 of 53 charges. One case lacked enough physical evidence, though Chikatilo had confessed to it. His sentence, death by firing squad. The courtroom erupted. Applause rang out and families of victims wept. For years, they had lived with the horror of unanswered questions. Now, at least, there was finality. Chikatilo's final words in court were eerily mundane: "I am a mistake of nature, a mad beast." But justice, at long last, was catching up. After years of horror, a guilty verdict, and 52 confirmed murders, the question still haunted the public: what do you do with a man like Andrei Chikatilo? On October 15, 1992, he was sentenced to death by firing squad. For the victims' families, it was closure, but not peace. Many still lived in the same towns where their loved ones vanished. Chikatilo's name remained a wound. But Soviet justice, now evolving under a newly independent Russia, moved slowly. Chikatilo remained on death row for 17 months, housed in Novocherkassk Prison. He was kept in solitary confinement, monitored 24/7, and reportedly displayed signs of increasing mental deterioration. He refused visitors, wrote obsessive letters, and became paranoid that guards were poisoning his food. Still, he never apologized to the families of his victims. According to prison staff, Chikatilo often rambled about his scientific purpose and how others would carry on his work. He never showed true remorse. Only frustration at being caught. On February 14, 1994, the monster of Rostov was finally executed. With no warning, he was taken from his cell and led to a concrete room. In accordance with Russian protocol, he was shot once behind the right ear. He was 57 years old. His body was buried in an unmarked grave, location undisclosed. His case sparked major reforms in Russian criminal profiling, forensic evidence collection, and public transparency. In fact, Chikatilo's capture led directly to the creation of the modern Russian investigative process, including national databases for violent crimes and specialized behavioral analysis units. His chief profiler, Dr. Alexander Bukhanovsky, became a national hero. His psychiatric assessment and early criminal profiling were instrumental in bringing Chikatilo down. He later trained Russian investigators in behavioral science, a legacy born from horror. The youngest victim was just 7 years old, the oldest in her 40s. Most were children, runaways, students, or people simply trying to get home. Some names were never released to the public, their families too traumatized to speak. Their final moments were unthinkable. Many suffered horrific violence before death. In Rostov-on-Don, memorials were created in silence. Schools held moments of silence. Flowers still appear near stations where victims vanished. For decades, the Russian people lived with fear, but also with resilience. Andrei Chikatilo wanted to go down in history. He did, but not as he hoped. Not as a scientist or martyr. Only as a madman, a predator, and a shameful reminder of what happens when justice comes too late. If you found this series powerful, subscribe to Worldwide Crime Time for more gripping investigations, real cases, and stories from around the world.